Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart, and in this video I wanted to take a little trip down memory lane and have a look at some of the wonderful resin terrain that Forgeworld used to make for Warhammer Fantasy, including this wonderful Warhammer Blacksmiths Forge that I have here. And at the same time I'll show you how I painted this one.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet.
Most of these items now are extremely rare and have a price tag to match if you're lucky enough to find one on eBay. The last time I found one I was looking to buy, the price just got so crazy that there was no way I was going to justify spending that kind of money. And I was very lucky with this one. It was given to me by my wonderful next door neighbor and also YouTuber, the KV Forge. If you go and check out his channel, I'll pop a link in the video description. He kindly gave me this, and that's the only reason I have it. It's absolutely wonderful. But I thought it'd be really fun to have a little look at some of the range and the things that Forgeworld used to make for Warhammer Fantasy, because many players might not be aware they used to make terrain. Maybe some of you can share stories of the things you may have or have seen or owned in the past and maybe regret getting rid of. But I'll also show you how I painted this one as well. There's a real mix of tutorial and general discussion around these beautiful old pieces of terrain. And I also want to discuss as well and touch on whether we'll ever see these things again now that we have the wonderful 3D printed buildings you can get out there from many manufacturers, and the emerging range of pre-colored, in many cases now, MDF buildings as well that are filling that space.
Many of you may not even be aware that Forgeworld ever made terrain for Warhammer Fantasy, so I thought I'd dig out a few old catalogues and give some examples of the kind of things that were available. So a beautiful Gothic graveyard set there and all kinds of fun things, watchtowers and roads and bridges. So these pieces were, as far as I know, traditionally constructed, so sculpted by hand, built by hand. A lot of these early ones by Simon Harris, I believe. In the catalogues, Forgeworld put the designers' names in, which is really cool looking back now. It's not something you see much anymore, but these are obviously cast in solid Forgeworld resin, not fine cast or anything like that. The original, really hard resin they did. Took a bit of cleaning up, but they're awesome things. And then we saw more things start to appear. There's that beautiful chapel there that could be used as a Bretonian chapel as well. If you ever see that on eBay, it goes for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Would love to get my hands on it one day, but I'm not sure I'll ever be rich enough. I think this is a photo I found online, shared in a few places, and it's from the cabinets of the time, in the Forgeworld cabinets at a games day, showing the studio version of it. It's quite hard to find pictures. There's another image of it there, including this brilliant coaching in. The last time I saw that on eBay, it went for about £650, painted as well, and not super well. And as we move into this 2008 catalogue, you see some of those things appearing in there, but with a few extras as well. So you've got a couple of earthworks there for Empire cannons, you've got some stables, you've got a small cottage, you've got a well, and of course the Blacksmiths Forge, which I'm going to be working on today, which again, it's just so cool. This one was designed by Simon Harris as well. And as I mentioned at the top of the video, I'm just so lucky to have this brand new unbuilt Blacksmith Forge given to me by Jeff from KV Forge. It's just absolutely beautiful, and I was so excited when he gave it to me. I've just been waiting for time to build it properly and talk a little bit about it. I didn't want to just paint it along with some of the other terrain projects I've done recently. I wanted to spend a little bit of time, give it its own video, and discuss these beautiful old pieces of terrain, and this is the perfect example for doing that. I've built quite a lot of Forgeworld resin over the years, especially early days, Horus Heresy, before any of these tanks had come back in the second edition now in plastic. They were all resin, and some of them are pretty tricky to build. So I'm quite experienced doing it. Some are really easy to do. Some I've got some problems with the cast or where the mold, where the vents and things were. This was pretty good, very easy to clean up. There are a few examples in the windows and things where the mold had obviously torn a little bit, so you needed to get in there with a knife or a flat flat file and smooth them out, but this was pretty straightforward. The gates and things had already been removed in the past. You can see there just that little example of where the mould has torn a little bit, so you get a little bit of a miscast in there, but it's easy enough to sort of carve away and file away, especially if you've worked on as many resin miniatures as I had. If you're not used to using resin miniatures, you do have to do this kind of stuff. It's just the nature of the way it's cast. Got that little rough edge on going around with one of my files now, just smoothing it over, making sure it looks fairly neat, and it didn't take very long at all. And because it's a resin miniature, you have to use super glue. You can't get away with plastic glue or PVA or anything like that. So I'm also using an activator agent there just to speed up the process a little bit. Just working out whether I could glue the roof together and remove the whole thing. But the way it fits in, it kind of slots in sideways at the same time. I realised that if I wanted access to the inside, I couldn't glue the roof together. So I had to work out a way of doing it with just one side being removed. So this is it primed black, and I decided to glue the one side on. It was chipping the paint every time I took it on and off, and while it's going to make it a little bit harder to paint some of the insides, it will mean that I don't take away any of the paintwork I've already finished. So this is Two Thin Coats Dungeon Stone Grey, but you can pick any greys really. I'm going to build up with a few layers of grey here to let the layers build up and do the heavy lifting. So I'm pointing my airbrush down slightly here, not completely from the top, but enough that those crevices are still showing as black in between the rocks. Why go in with a solid thick coat of grey paint and have to put that all back afterwards? I'm using the detail on the miniature to do some of the work for me. I continued layering that grey for pretty much the whole miniature. So you got the wooden doors, you got the inside of the roof, and the outside as well. I'm actually working with the detail on the miniature, so it's not a very flat roof. You can see where these tiles are bowed and settled over the years. So I'm actually making sure that I leave some of that black showing through, building in the shadow already. So rather than just using that black as a pure prime coat, I'm actually painting on top of that already and just going to slowly build it all up layer by layer. And then this is Wizard Grey, so I'm just moving up through the shades of grey here, up through the triads in this particular range of paint, but just pick your own set of greys. You really want sort of minimum 2, ideally 3 or 4. You can see here I'm working even harder at turning the miniature on the side so that paint doesn't obliterate the previous layer and still works with that detail, so leaving that shadow underneath, because again it will just build in that colour for me and save me lots of work later on. As before, the same applies for those wooden areas, so the doorways. You can see I've got the angle of my airbrush from the top, so I'm keeping that shadow in underneath. I'm just focusing to the bottom of the wooden window frames that are poking out as part of that roof as well. With the light, we catch that little touch more. Again, it will help with the later painting stages. So as I continue to move through those grey stages, this is Charadon grey from that same Two Thin Coats range. Just really enjoying these at the moment, and they're absolutely brilliant through the airbrush. If you're an airbrush user and you've not tried them through the airbrush, they're just really good. I've not had any problems with them at all, especially with more problematic paints that are higher up that white kind of scale. So your lighter greys and whites and things can be quite chalky, can sometimes be a bit of a pain with blockages and things, especially through non-airbrush paints, but these are just brilliant. Same method here, just continuing to build up those layers, focusing a little bit more as I get lighter each time towards where that light would hit, trying to leave those previous shades and just kind of slowly building up the layers of grey. I'm even working on the base a little bit here, just by going in at an angle. It's actually collecting the detail, making it deliberately a little bit patchy, because I'm going to base that with thin wash kind of layers later on as well. Again, we continue with the same method, building up on all the wooden areas as well. Now I'm going all the way up to white here. This is Trooper White. I'm obviously not going to go over all of the stone areas. They are grey and I want them to stay grey. But the wooden areas, they're going to need a bit of a lift as well, because I'm going to be using some glazes in a moment. And while my hand's in the way here, I am just adding it to a lot of the wooden areas. So that main beam across the centre and getting into the barrel that's inside the actual forge itself, catching the inside of that glued in roof and those kind of things. But then we move on to those wooden supports in between the stone areas. I'm still using the airbrush here just to lighten them slightly, very subtly, lighten them slightly, working my way down pillar at a time. There's obviously quite a lot of wooden framing on this building, so working my way around the whole thing before, again, I move on to the bits we've already been lining. So those front doorways, the inside of the roof areas for support, very much the same as before, trying to aim from the top down a little bit, leaving the previous colours behind, and you get in a really kind of slow zenithal build up. Now onto some contrast. We've got Quetzalcoatl Scales and Eldari Emerald. You'll have seen me use similar kinds of colours before on roofs if you watch some of my previous painting tutorials on Warhammer Fantasy terrain. What I'm doing here is I thin them slightly, so it's probably 1 part water to 2 parts contrast paint through the airbrush, and again I'm working with the direction of travel of the roof, so I'm working from the top towards the bottom, trying to give an idea of streaks going in one direction, because over time hopefully the rain has been flowing down on that roof, and if there's any streaks and things they will be going in that direction, so I want that to build that into the paint. I've already got that grayscale built in from the previous airbrushing, and because these layers are so thin, they're basically airbrush filters or glazes, you're leaving that shadow poking through. I'm just doing a mixture of those two colours and slowly staining and building it up, and as you can see the effect is really quite pleasing. So some of that dark is showing through, some of the lighter areas, and by going in that direction you get this really kind of nice effect on the roof. So now it's time for some dry brushing. I'm going to use one of the newer style dry brushes you get, the makeup style ones, a really soft bristled one. And the plan is to cover most of the stone area over what's going to be the wooden areas. I even add a little bit to the roof area just from an upwards direction as well, just to pick out the edges of those tiles ever so slightly. Very thin layers of dry brushing here. I don't want to have any streaks at all, so I'm really lots of circular motions, very little paint on the brush. So as we move a few years along in terms of Forge World catalogues, things have changed a little bit. We have Warhammer Forge now to do with Tamokan and the Monsters Arcanum books with lots of special miniatures for those, and the focus is really around those miniatures for the games and less terrain, though there is this really cool sought after realm of battle board, section, not the whole board. It's the Earthworks, and I'd love to get my hands on that one day. I can't help but wonder that these days, with these beautiful examples of these printed scenery here, there's a wonderful company that does these huge ranges of 3D prints. There's obviously hundreds and hundreds of different examples of 3D printed terrain out there, but this is just one company that does so much and is a great example of the kind of things that you can buy printed now, or buy the STLs and print yourself. And I can see why Forge World would no longer do the kind of things that we're looking at in this video today. The quality of MDF terrain is getting better and better all the time as well. So what you see on the screen there is an example of new micro art studio stuff. They just started doing stuff for World War II as well. It's absolutely incredible. And again, if it's that good, pre-printed, you don't even need to paint it. I can understand why Forge World aren't interested in producing stuff like this again. And now with Kill Team, the new Kill Team starter set, even Games Workshop is getting on board with pre-printed coloured MDF terrain as well. So time for some more contrast, and this is Gore Grunter Fur, Mantis Warriors Green and Garagak Sewer. This is beginning to make probably its 3rd or 4th appearance on the channel now as a method. I tend to use 2 different types of brown and a green. They vary from video to video to paint job to paint job, but if you've not seen it before, I'll briefly take you through the process. So first of all, you'll need what we've already shown. You need that kind of grayscale wood already, something that allows a little bit of the dark there, allows the white to be on the top, so dry brushing helps to really pick out that detail. And then you need contrast style paints, of which are thinned with water, about 2 parts contrast to 1 part water. It does vary a little bit, you can do different thicknesses, and you can see what I'm doing here is I'm painting it on the miniature and then wet blending those 3 different colours together. So sometimes focusing really heavily with a particular colour like a green to make it punchy in one area, and then blending it through the more orangey wood or the darker, more desaturated style colour of wood, and just mixing around, being a little bit random. But as they kind of blend together as they're wet, you get this really nice kind of old silvered wood effect. I just love it. It comes out so nicely. It's really easy to do and it just looks great. Now, I'm trying to be fairly careful not to get too much on the grey areas. You obviously get little spillages and splashes along the way, but if I do, I tend to rinse my brush off quickly and just sort of smooth it out, take the worst of it off. It doesn't matter too much because we're going to be staining the rocks and things with oil paints in a moment anyway. But again, just trying to keep that grey stone area looking as neat as possible, but it's pretty easy. The miniature is pretty large, the detail's really good, so the paint just tends to flow all between the different wooden areas anyway, and you can stick to the detail. Really, it's doing the job for you. Like with the other parts of the miniature, I've got to paint the inside as well, so using the same method, probably slapping it on a little bit thicker inside, especially where it's not going to be seen, but still trying to keep to my method of blending those three colours together, doing the same on all of the window sills, on that separate doorway as well. It was a little tricky to get into the barrels and the bellows and the other little bits of detail that are in there with that one side of the roof stuck on, and it's even trickier to get the camera to show me getting in there, as you've probably noticed now, but it wasn't so tricky that it wasn't worth me sticking the roof on in the first place. And again, most of it's going to be hidden, you can hardly see it anyway. For the tiling on the inside of the chimney brass inside the building, I didn't want to give it the same kind of blue tones that I had outside, so I just used Gorgrunter fur here. I think I might have splashed a little bit green in certain areas, but again, because of that kind of zenithal grey prime we've got underneath there, it picks up that detail really well. Earlier you saw me airbrushing the base as well in the similar colours, and I gave it a dry brush as well, which picked out all those bits of texture and rock, and all I did was mix those three paints together, the two browns and the green, to make one horrible baby poo kind of colour, as any way I can describe it. But I'm just giving that a thin glaze all over, and it's a perfect way of just giving it a base to work on for the other effects that we're going to add. It's thin enough that it shows that detail through as well. There's a couple of little areas that require a metal base coat. At this stage I'm using dwarven iron from two thin coats, but any kind of dull gunmetal style colour will probably work in this. You've got the hinges on the main door, and there's a little metal area on the bellows, and there are a few metal nails that are in the woodwork that you might want to pick out as well, but it's not essential. Oh, and yes, of course, there was the metal bands that were around the barrel in the corner, which you can see from my paintbrush angle was achieved, but was a little bit tricky. Now it's time for some oil washes. This is grease, dark mud and green moss, a trio of ready mixed oil washes from the Soilworks range, which is a scale 75 product. I really like these because I'm a little bit lazy at times and I don't always want to mix my own oil paints. They're not very harsh on your paints as well, so I've not protected the miniature here at all. The paint is fully dry. This is contrast paints and things as well, notorious for rubbing off, but I've left them to dry and I'm just painting in now with the oil paints. So I'm using these like some people would use a standard wash, like an Agarax shade or something like that. Apologies to people that hear this be on a lot of my videos, but I will go through it very briefly for those of you who've not heard before. So oil paints work slightly different. They've got a thinner base in them, so when that dries and evaporates away, you're left with something that streaks far less than a standard wash would do. It also leaves a nice effect as well, usually quite dry and matte effect, so it'll look like it's weathered and dirt on the building, and that's why I'm painting in these streaks. Now while they're wet they look a little bit uniform and a little bit in your face here, but I'm just mixing these three different shades of oil paints together, and you'll see that when they dry a lot duller and they just look fantastic on there. Now the beauty of the oil paints is you can rub them off afterwards. You can use a little bit of clean artist white spirit as well to change them, to clean them off or to thin them down and reshape the marks and things you've made in a way that you can't do with a standard wash, that once it's dry it's on there and you have to go back and add more paint over afterwards just to kind of tidy it up. And you can see there's a various textures here. I'm almost stippling with it here, knowing that when it dries all of those brush marks and things will just disappear. And you can use it all over the miniature. So I'm adding those same streaks and things in patches throughout the stonework, allowing it to run in between all of that detail on the stones where the dirt and grime would get in between the different areas of stonework. Towards the bottom there, I'm just pushing in some of the green into the bottom where maybe there's sort of mold and things growing up from the damp soil underneath. Really just thinking, what does an old decrepit building like this, what would it look like? Where would there be dirt? Where would there be dust and things from people travelling or passing? Where would there be mould and things like that? And then just kind of go into town on it really. And if you don't have that kind of image in your head, get online, Google things, look at some pictures of some old buildings and look at where they're weathered and where they're dirty, and just have some fun with it. On some of my previous tutorials like this, I've done a very similar thing, just using thinned down contrast paints like I did on the roof through the airbrush, those same kinds of colours, and you can do that as well. And as long as you get the paint where you want it and clean it off straight away, and then that's fine as well. But I really like using these oils just because of the effect they make when they dry afterwards. And once I've worked my way around the stonework, I'm even putting splashes on the ground as well. So splashes of that green. Once it dries, as I say, it dries out a little bit duller, a little bit matter, and it just looks like variations in the soil colour. Now at that stage I went to bed, and this is what it looks like first thing in the morning. As you can see, all those streaks have gone. They don't look wet anymore, and all of that oil paint, all that thinner is evaporated, and it leaves that really nice dry matte effect, which is just a lovely way of weathering your buildings. From now on, it's pretty much effects. These are 2 Deer Armor FX thick mud products, and these are effects rather than a basing texture. I talk about that a lot. This is a basing texture, the earth texture, a bit like your Citadel Sterling mud, but these two do a different thing. They're good for stippling on and creating mud effects. You've got 2 different styles. The European mud, which is in my right hand, is much more fibrous, and the thicker you place that on, the more it looks like wet mud. But first of all, we're starting with that slightly grayer tone. I just wanted to put this a little bit heavier inside the building. The earth would be drier inside the building. Obviously the rain's not getting in, any water and moisture is either coming in, seeping up through the ground, or through feet being walked in to the building. And I thought this would be a nice way of kind of building up the texture inside. It looks a little bit bright at first, but trust me, it tones down. And while there's hardly any on my brush, I'm even just putting the odd little mark on the roof as well. Wipe it off if it's a bit too heavy. It just looks like staining on the roof. Maybe it's a bit of bird mess or something like that. It just really adds to that lived in look that I'm after with this building. Moving on to that European mud now. Again, a little bit inside, but not as much as the grey, just to kind of build up those multiple colours. And again, it looks a bit odd now, but you'll see when I've added some pigment and things in a moment, it really tones it all down anyway. So I'm just building up textures. And again, outside as well, building up more in the doorway where the feet tread mostly, allowing it a little bit over the plinth where the feet have taken it inside the building. But I will add a few spots all the way around the building as well. I even just try to get the side of the wall slightly, again, where passing traffic would have flicked mud and dirt up on the wall and staining that stonework a little bit. Now it's time for some pigments, dry pigments. I've got a burnt sienna and a light sienna there. 2 different brown tones, so I can blend them together a little bit. I'm just going to brush them into all of that detail. I have waited for the previous paints to dry before I do this, otherwise you just end up with a mess. And the idea is I'm just sort of giving it a bit of a dusty tone inside. It's obviously drier inside the building. I want it to look dry. So I'm brushing it all in there. I blow off the excess quite heavily, so there's very little left in there at all. So if I run my finger over it, it's not really coming off on my hands anymore, because it's really right into that detail in between all of that basically sand, rather than sitting on the top of it. I know you could use a fixative. I prefer to leave it with this dry looking effect. Fix it if you like to. It will change the tone. It will dull it right down. You can obviously make up washes and things to give it a similar kind of effect, but I just quite like brushing it in like this. It does a good job for me. It's a lot quicker and easier. Right into those final stages now, just adding tufts and a few flowers and things like that. I'm using the same ones that I used on the basis for my armies and my other terrain, so it all kind of builds together as one complete collection. So when it's on my table, they will match very, very nicely with my armies. Now just going back with some of that same thick mud, the European mud this time, I just like to blend it in certain sections of where the tufts have gone home. It just makes them look more like they're part of the same ground and the same earth, rather than just stuck on the top. So sometimes a little bit on top of the tufts, a little bit round at the edges, just looks like slightly wetter areas of mud where the moisture hasn't seeped away and drained away quite as much. And that is pretty much it. So stick around for some proper pictures rather than me just holding it and turning around here. But I'm really happy with the way that's come out. So sadly, I think the days of resin terrain from companies like Games Workshop have gone. It's pretty cool to think that these were built in the way that a scratch scale modeler would build something, and then it's being cast, and I imagine they didn't survive the master molds very well with the kind of things they would have been made out of. But you get these beautiful characterful pieces. It makes sense that they don't exist anymore as a main production thing. You can get such amazing pieces of work done through 3D artists these days, and printing them on resin printers these days. You'll get absolutely fantastic pieces that you couldn't do like this. You just couldn't get them to mold and cast properly. So it's very, very cool to have the opportunity to work on a piece like this. I still love to get my hands on the coaching in one day, but it definitely couldn't cost me £600 or £700. I just couldn't justify that at all. But maybe one day I'll be lucky enough to get one. But I'm so happy to have been able to paint this one, and thank you very much again, Jeff, for giving it to me. What a kingly gift it really was.
Thank you very much for watching. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and took something from it, be that entertainment, the look back at some wonderful old miniatures, or the tutorial parts of the video as well. Maybe you've picked up some painting tips and tricks along the way there. And please do comment below. Let me know what you think of the paint job. Let me know what you're using for buildings, what manufacturers. Maybe you know some great sources for 3D printed buildings. I have a small resin printer, so it's not brilliant at doing terrain, but I know there's some awesome printers out there who will do these things for you as well, and I may look to expand my buildings. So far I have mainly Citadel things, all of the things we've seen recently re-released for Warhammer the Old World, which are fantastic, and I've been using some of the Middle Earth strategy battle buildings as well. The Lake Town house is super flexible and versatile to rebuild into very Warhammer Empire-esque looking buildings. Do check out my Mordheim table. I'll put a link in for that video now if you haven't seen that already. Those buildings are fantastic for Warhammer Fantasy as well. But don't forget to check out the channel sponsors Baron of Dice. There's a link below, including a discount code in the video description. Check out my other affiliate links as well. It's a great way of supporting the channel. Join us over on Discord for some really friendly chats there as well. If you're a patron member, you get access to a little bit more of the Discord compared to normal members. There's loads of other benefits for patrons as well, so check that out as well. There's a link below, including a monthly giveaway, so it's always worth being signed up regardless of the tier you're on. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.
Will my bad luck never end? Firstly, Dieter goes back to the border princes. Then I get that letter from Talabheim saying I'm no longer welcome as a state trooper and I had to send my uniform back. I know I wasn't the bravest, or even in Talabheim for that matter, but still, I still think I was doing a decent job. I mean, it's only 100 miles away and I did like that nice white and red uniform. Well, that's it. I'm off to seek my own adventures. I'll show them, and I'll show Dieter that I can be a big, brave warrior too. Hello, my name's Bernard. Are you a gnome?
How very dare you? I am a great dwarf wizard.
Like Paul Daniels?
Come inside out of the rain, and I will tell you my tale.
Oh, nice book. Has it got any good pictures in it?